Welcome to the 6th edition of the Joe Berry Award podcast series. These podcasts, presented by former winners of the Joe Berry Award and award sponsors, are designed to provide insight into the retail market during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. Our presenters today are Joe Berry Award winners Bernie Brookes AM and Anthony George, discussing inside the retail market during COVID. Bernie won the 1986 inaugural Joe Berry Award, going on to take some of the leading roles in Australian retail, such as Head of Supermarkets at Woolworths and CEO for Myer Department Stores. Anthony, who won the award in 2000, is now Head of Merchandise Operations for Metcash. The podcast will provide you with a preview of our 2021 award topics, which will be posted on opening day, November the 1st, 2020. You can find them on Facebook and the joeberryaward.com.au website. 2021 will be the 35th presentation of this unique and prestigious award, which will be promoted globally. The Joe Berry Award provides a unique level of exposure for you and your career aspirations. The 8 Joe Berry Award podcasts will get you ready to register in November. We hope that you are enjoying these podcasts. The true understanding of what damage the pandemic is doing to the retail industry belongs to those who are in the midst of it all. We are pleased to present 2 highly experienced retail industry managers discussing the depth of COVID-19 in retail. Bernie?
Yeah, thanks, Keith, and hello, everybody. It's a great opportunity for Anthony and myself to talk through some of the key retail issues that are occurring right now, and let's do exactly that. Anthony, welcome, and let me get straight into the first question to keep the flow going. Let's start with the customer. So, from your point of view, what does COVID-19 mean for consumer trends and needs at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Bernie. Look, always good to start with the customer, and I think the thing to remember is that it's actually impacted every aspect of their lives. So, whether it's work, whether it's learning, communications, how they entertain, travel, mobility, even how they play, it's all been impacted. So that then flows into, I guess, the consumption patterns and what they're doing. And it's been interesting being in the midst of it that you've seen 3 kind of patterns. So initially there was like the whole panic buying, the world's going to end. I need to get whatever I can in whatever quantities I can. Then as people started to realize the world's not going to end, but I'm still uncertain, it was more about stocking up on those things that are important. And then a return to normal, but it's actually a new normal. And if I talk about some of the trends we're seeing, probably the main one is that move to larger baskets and bigger main shops, and driven by a couple of things, particularly during COVID. The first one's probably the safety bit, restrictions, not wanting to get out of the house. If I'm reducing the number of visits, it's almost the opposite trend of what we've seen over the last 10 years of people who move to a lot more frequent shops. People have moved to a reduced number of visits, actually bigger baskets, and also kind of building in a buffer for what's the unknown, what's the uncertainty. Part of that's also cooking from home has been a big trend that has come out through COVID. Again, people are concerned about the safety aspects leaving home. But the other thing, when you look at a lot of the research, is people just have more time. They're not commuting as much. So you put the 2 together, you get this combination of I'm cooking from home, plus I'm uncertain, plus I don't want to go out as much. The end result are bigger baskets and a bigger main shop, which is what we saw through COVID. The other key thing that we've seen, and particularly in Metcash, is a move to local driven by those same things. We have restrictions in some states are very specific, 5 kilometres from the home during part of this. So that really brings a local flavour. And people trying to limit their time away and not go where big crowds are. What we've also seen is a swing, although it's been an ongoing growth trend, people really becoming aware of health and well-being. Nothing gets you thinking about your health and where you are with it than a worldwide pandemic. So we're seeing that starting to grow in the categories. Another key aspect that I've found really interesting when I look at it is price. So we went through a period where, and I don't think I've ever seen in my career, I'd almost say people weren't too concerned about price for a few weeks there. It was just about what can I get. But we're seeing that to come back now in price and competition in the market starting to pick up as normality starts to return. Probably one of the biggest trends that's been interesting is the supply and demand curves we've seen have actually meant that people have been forced to try new retail or new products that they wouldn't normally do. So we're seeing a lot of switching occurring, where people are switching to brands that maybe they didn't try before because their brand's out of stock, or they're switching to a particular retailer because they're now wanting to shop local, or they're switching to private label because the branded products have sold out and now they're going to something that maybe they hadn't had a look at before. I read an article the other day, and McKinsey is saying that 40% of consumers, they believe, have switched to brands that they normally wouldn't buy. Really driven by that fact that they haven't had choice, and it's been an opportunity maybe for some of those secondary, tertiary brands to come to the fore. And probably the last big trend that we've seen is obviously the move to online. That's been growing, but I think it's the mix of online. It's now people looking at multiple options rather than just shopping online. Am I shopping online for home delivery? Am I shopping online for click and collect? Parcel pickups making resurgence? Am I ordering in, getting my Uber Eats, my menu log? Am I buying through Marley Spoon, through HelloFresh? So there's this kind of leapfrog that's happening with online. Obviously different by demographic and people's propensity with technology, but seeing a lot of that coming through. So they're the key trends that I've seen from my perspective, Boone.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. And I guess from my point of view, that therefore means there are some winners and losers in the COVID-19 retail environment. And I'm thinking a little bit about some of the, starting with some of the winners. And no doubt if you're in the fresh or organic produce area, packaged foods, beverage, preventative healthcare, particularly PPE products as an example, household care products, vitamin supplements, out of home and in-home entertainment, anything that provides that, I think particularly streaming services. And generally, I think even the utility companies are getting some benefit out of people spending more time at home. We've seen a real group of what I would call winners, and then we've seen a real group of losers, and you're either in the haves or have not. And I think it's also not as clear as that, because you can take something like medicinal products and suddenly the chemists and pharmacies went berserk when the pandemic first started. But now, as people are not getting as many colds and flus, for example, down sort of 80% on last year because of all the preventative measures, we're seeing things like cough and cold dramatically struggle. So you get these things that are great success stories and then suddenly fall off a cliff. But there are some categories that have just been struggling from day one. And I think travel is a good example of that. Anything to do with travel. Can you imagine trying to run a luggage company at the moment? Anything with luxury fashion, women's clothing, outerwear, some of the shoes and footwear categories struggling, particularly dress shoes, men's clothing, anything to do with restaurants and hospitality, no doubt struggling as well. Even things like tobacco and smoking, all starting to struggle. And of course, the beauty business of cosmetics and perfume, not only for services, but also for product as well. Medical procedures, right the way through to Botox in that space. And an indifferent story about alcohol. We're seeing sort of 40% of the population drink more and 40% of the population drink less, which I was in the 40% drinking less, but I spending too much time at home. So I think we're seeing all these winners and all these losers in the market. But if you go back to what's happening around the world, there is an interesting bit of trend or DNA. And if you just look at some of the major companies around the world and see how they've fared in the sort of so far this year compared to last year, you've got companies like Ahold up 3 billion to 77 billion, Aldi up 5 billion to 108 billion, Alibaba up from $500 billion to 627, Amazon up from 356 billion to 426. Things like Home Depot up from 110 to 115 billion, JD.com from 185 to 221 billion, Walmart up from 521 to 533 billion, Woolworths Australia from 36 to nearly $37.5 billion. So what we're seeing is that if you're in the food space, if you're in the Home Depot type space, if you're in the online space, you're running amok. You're having a good time in the sun, and although it's costing more to serve, as seen by some of the profitability declines in areas such as Woolworths, it's fair to say that if you're in that space, you're doing well. But then if you look at the reverse aspect of the number of liquidations, administrations we've had, particularly in that fashion space, there are some winners and there are some losers. Anthony, what does it mean for retailers? I mean, you supply a lot of retailers. What are you hearing from a retailer point of view?
Yeah, thanks, Bernie. I think particularly in the industries that Metcash services are fortunate to probably be in that winner bucket that you just outlined in terms of food and home improvement. It's interesting that it's at multiple levels. So you've literally got to go down to a very pragmatic, practical level to understand the impacts almost out of sight that it's having on retailers, because that's impacting their P&L. Although you alluded to Woolworths and some of the cost impost that they've incurred. And when you look at retail, there's a large cost impost of this, and particularly in those retail channels that are doing better out of COVID, there's still a large cost impost. One of the things that we're hearing retailers say is that they need to both appear and be safe. So there's a perception element of safety as well as the reality of that safety. If you were to walk through, particularly in those states where you can at the moment, a shopping centre, and you look at the differences when you look through those shop front windows, whether it's the signage, the floor decals, the hand sanitizer on entry, the mask. I think those retailers who are doing better are the ones who are overtly presenting that safety. You can come into my store, you can still engage, you can still purchase, and you can do that in a safe way. So for bricks and mortar, there's ways that people are doing that to still give the consumer that feeling of safety. It's about overtly calling that out. It is the hand sanitizer. It's seeing someone when I walk into a JB and I see someone standing there doing a customer account, I feel a little bit more comfortable that they're managing to a social distancing limit than if I hadn't seen that. It's the visual cues, it's the shields that you see at the checkouts, it's the mask, it's contactless payments, it's those things. But it all comes with a cost. And, I think right now for retail, it's about how do you manage all aspects of the P&L to remain as profitable as you can. Whether your sales are growing because you're in those categories that's occurring in, or they're not, it's still about having a more granular look at your total P&L than you probably ever had to do before, because your costs are going up, sales may or may not be going up, and as my point before around pricing, as people kind of get back to a level of normality, then margins will continue to be squeezed with competition with that occurring. The other thing for me when I listen to retailers and talk with people, it's how do you make the shopping experience COVID relevant? And that's not putting COVID on a pedestal. It's more thinking about your merchandising, thinking about your physical space in store. What can you do different in a COVID or a post-COVID world? What do you do around those categories in store to make them more accessible? To give you the volumes that you need to support them, whether it's dual location, off locations, what signage to call that out. If I'm stressed, if I'm looking for a mask, if I'm looking for something, I don't want to have to look through a whole store to find that. I want to know where that is. So how do you make that easier? Obviously, online and click and collect a big impact for retailers in terms of either growing that or enhancing their capability. But I think the key thing for retailer is, whether it's COVID or it's not, it's always about understanding, going back to the customer, to the consumer. And if you think about those changes I alluded before, that means there's impacts in what the retailer has to think about. So bigger baskets, more made shops, reduced frequency. What does that mean for a retailer? How do you merchandise? How do you manage customer flows in that? Do you have to, if you're a small store and you're used to just having baskets, do you need to get a bigger basket because people are doing more bigger shops? The other thing I think for a retailer perspective is to think about some of that brand switching. What's the role of private label now? Have people been introduced to new products? Are you going to see those demands on those new products increase that maybe you haven't seen before? And I also think where it is available, there's probably going to be a switch to more trusted brands. And we're starting to see that where in this kind of world of uncertainty, people want certainty and something they feel confident in and they can trust. I think if you step out of the store, you then got to start thinking about how do you communicate to your consumers? What's your media mix look like? Those things that require hands-on delivery. We've seen recently announcements about catalogs, what's going on there about a move to online. But what does that look like in terms of how you engage with your consumer? How do you move to digital? Is there a potential resurgence of TV? Not something we would have seen coming, but if you think more and more people sitting at home, we know through streaming services, etc., the demand there, but what does that mean? How do you think about your overall media mix? And then I think the final thing really does come down, two last things. One is the managing the CODB, that P&L perspective. What does it mean? We hear a lot about people renting in terms of households and landlords and that discussion. What does that mean for a retailer in terms of rent if they're not in one of those categories that are doing well? And I think the last key thing is contingency planning. If you're a retailer right now, you have to be contingency planning, and you're having to do that at different levels. You've got to, at a total business level, what does it mean if one of your suppliers has to shut their DC or has to shut the manufacturing plant because there's a COVID outbreak? What does it mean if your freight provider suddenly has to take trucks off the road because there's been a COVID outbreak at a depot? What does it mean in your local store if someone suddenly comes in and they're tested positive to COVID and all the store team members in that store have to go into isolation for 2 weeks? And these are all real occurrences that have played out over the last few months and will continue to play out if we see outbreaks. So I think that contingency planning is at a much higher level than probably it's ever needed to be for retailers. And that's what I'm seeing now. And I guess the question I'd like to ask you, Bernie, is what do you see as some of the retail implications moving forward, though?
Yeah, I think, Anthony, it's really going to change some of the mindset of boards of retail businesses, senior executives. I mean, there's no doubt that what we've gone through is there's been no rule book established before. It's a once in a lifetime pandemic. Hopefully it's once in a lifetime. And first and foremost, I think you forget that it is in fact a global healthcare crisis, but the implications of that are far reaching for retail. And we've really seen what I would call 5 years of retail change occur in probably 3 to 6 months. And, we knew that online and omni-channel was going to grow significantly each year, but I think it's accelerated at such a length. And you see in Australia, the success of Temple, of Webster, of Kogan, of Catch, and basically everybody's online business has accelerated significantly. And once you get through this initial stage that occurred of lockdown with people looking after their house and garden while they're locked down and stocking up on basics and what you would call the sort of toilet roll phenomenon, people then started to return to some normality as the shops opened, but that normality is quite different. So I think, as Anthony described so well, as to what retailers are doing and more importantly, what the consumers are thinking, I think for me, you've got to look and say what's going to happen over the next few years and what's changed in the dialect of consumer talk. And I think firstly, they've now realised ever more so that cash is king. And we've seen a lot of insolvency occur. We've seen a lot of issues with cash flow, businesses closing stores. So I think the first thing that's going to occur, obviously, is going to be that a focus on cash. The second thing is I don't think
we can think of social distancing and disinfecting and protecting people as being a short-term phenomenon. It's going to be something that's going to be here forever. And as people lay out stores and people lay out shopping centres, I think there's no doubt they're going to be looking at it and saying, I'm going to have a need for a very different layout of a store, more space, more social distancing. Once we've started in that, it's going to be here to stay. I think also retailers are looking to divest as many bricks and mortar stores as they can. I mean, if you've got a portfolio of, say, 300 stores today, and the answer is how many are you going to need in 5 to 10 years' time, and is probably half that much, maybe even less, and you're going to need a more digital savvy business. You're going to be looking at less bricks and mortar space, more shop fronts, and obviously a real investment. And so therefore the shopping centres are going to struggle significantly as well. But I'd also add that I think retailers are going to look for growth coming in digital and online and marketplaces, etc., going forward. And there won't be a sudden sharp recovery. There'll be, when everything gets back to some normality, it will be a new normal, which will mean people will be looking to get out and treat themselves, yes. But I think longer term, the effects of the high amount of funds pulled out of superannuation funds, combined with people that haven't necessarily been paying their mortgage, with the heavy false bottom that's been established with JobKeeper and JobSeeker, as a lot of that winds back, we're going to see a reality of what will be a new norm, and it'll be pretty frugal, I think, from a customer's point of view. And obviously, we're then going to see the rise of private label to associate with that, and we're going to see people, if you like, saving for a rainy day. So retailers are going to have to get smarter digitally. They're going to be relying on things like artificial intelligence a lot more than they have in the past. And I think there'll be enormous growth in both artificial intelligence, but also in business intelligence, as you try and compensate for the lack of sort of bricks and mortar sales that we're seeing in the business. And even for those in the sweet spot at the moment, those people that are going very, very well, that time in the sun that they've had in food and organic products and all the winners, they're not necessarily going to continue, and they're going to have to learn about this new normal as well. And I think lastly, this reliance on China, as evidenced from supply chain interruption, what you would call some of the political issues going on, is also mean that we're going to look at diversifying a lot of that supply chain as well, which is a good sort of lead, I think, to a question for you, Anthony. I mean, what do you think of the implications for supply chain, particularly in regard to refurbishment or replenishment, and forecasting?
Probably three things: volatility, volatility, volatility. And I don't say that lightly, as having to be accountable for that in my role. I think significant impact. It's probably the most significant change in the most dynamic environment I've ever seen. To put it in perspective, and it's different by retailer, but for most retailers, imagine, and for those in the industry understand what amount of planning goes into managing Christmas volumes, right? Imagine greater than Christmas volumes for an extended period of time with limited warning. And that's what's happened to a lot of retailers, particularly through that panic buying phase, and not knowing when that's going to end, and dealing with that uncertainty. So when I look at it, Bernie, I'll break it down into the two areas. So what's going on around the volatility in demand, and how do you manage that, and the volatility of supply. So if I think about demand, it's being driven by a couple of things, is what I'm seeing. It's obviously the panic buying as we move into the stock up buying, and then we move into a new normal. It's about understanding what is new normal. What are those categories that demand is going to be higher in? What are those categories where demand's going to drop? What are those changes in consumer behaviour that we need to get ahead of the curve of, because they might be ever so subtle, but as they start to roll forward, that's going to impact those demand curves. You mentioned private label. I think this is one that we absolutely need to keep an eye on as retailers, as people have switched to that, as the economic conditions drive that. How do you get ahead of that to make sure you've got the right volume of inventory coming through? I think there's also category impacts that impact that ability to manage that demand curve. So which categories are going to be focus categories? When do they switch? When do some of these trends start to wean away so that you don't get left with that inventory in the system and the consumers moved on, or they've gone back to some form of normal behavior? What are the halo effects? You know, if you look at some of these out of stocks, what are the products that consumers are switching to? How do you plan for that? How do you get that demand right? And then I think the other thing from volatility, you've got these different layers going on. So as you're trying to plan for that, you're thinking about what's going on at a national level. Above that, you actually think about what's going on at an international level, to your point around China and other markets. At a national level, you know, we see in Australia where at a state level, what's going on in WA versus Victoria is very, very different. What does that mean in terms of those demand curves? How do you plan for that? And then you've got to get right down to the store level, because a store, you could have two stores, normal trading patterns, not that distant from each other. Suddenly one's in a lockdown zone, the other isn't. What does that mean? And when you start to ripple that up and cross your network, that can have big ramifications. I think, you know, the way people are responding to that, and unfortunately history, we don't have history to rely on here. So it's about trying to take that best guess. I often talk about it's not about being right, it's about being less wrong when it comes to forecasting. And that means looking at what are those categories where maybe you can afford to have a bit of safety stock, that they've got those long shelf lives, they're not perishable. You can bring that in. They're not trend-based products, so you can cover that off. Implications, again, it goes back to cash flow and P&L. What can you afford to carry in terms of inventory to cover some of that demand? Then on the supply side, we've seen some really big fluctuations. You know, I think we're very fortunate in Australia. We have a good supply chain, a fairly collaborative supply chain, and I don't think we've seen anywhere near the issues that have been seen elsewhere in the world. But when you reflect on it, where it really starts to come unstuck is when, and we've seen this happen quite a few times, where a manufacturer's whole production facility goes out for cleaning because of a COVID-19 outbreak, where their depot goes out, where their freight provider goes out. And that can start to have ripple effects. And, you know, as a retailer, and particularly in a merchandise function, that means you've got to start looking about where do you source equivalent products for your consumer to still be able to have that need met. What we're seeing is some of the manufacturers are starting to range rationalize. So that capacity they do have to meet that increase in demand, trying to maximize that by maybe reducing some of that range tail and move that production capability into those high volume lines that consumers are after. And I think you've got to look at it at a whole of supply chain level. So, you know, whether it's international shipping, we can't have the blinkers on and be thinking about what's going on in Australia, particularly in private label and any of the import products. You know, what happens in Spain, what happens in China, what happens in Hong Kong is critically important for us in terms of a lot of those products that are sourced from overseas. The flip side of that, it probably provides a great opportunity for locally grown products that maybe haven't been able to get cut through before. But they're the sort of implications we've got to think about in managing the supply chain. And similar to retail, it's very much around how do you manage those contingencies. If a cargo services company suddenly has to shut down because of a COVID outbreak, where are your shipping containers? How do you manage that? How do you manage that through? So if I just go back to the beginning, it's all about volatility and uncertainty, Bernie. And I think all the models in the world can't prepare you for what we're dealing with. And this is one of those occasions where I think people and IT and technology coming together really, really critical, where you take the best of the system-based forecasting but you have to apply that real world, real-time insights to modify that, given there's no precedent. So it's certainly an interesting time. And we've seen companies go up and down in that as they've had to close. And probably a good segue into a question I wanted to ask you about, do you think we've seen the last of companies going broke through COVID? Do you think there's more of that coming? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a good question because we've seen an acceleration, but I think firstly remember that the pandemic actually accelerated the speed of change. It didn't actually change the direction. So, I mean, we were heading towards less bricks and mortar and more omni-channel. We were heading towards greater productivity per square metre. And I think what this has done is accelerated it. And for those companies that didn't have alternate supply lines, for those companies that didn't have good, robust cost basis, for those companies that didn't have a focus on private label to maintain margin, then we've seen them effectively run into difficulty. And that bus side includes predominantly apparel at the moment, but it's things such as PAS, which have everything from Review to Black Pepper to a number of brands, to the Dimmies Group, to the Harris Scarf chain, right the way then through to Sea Folly. And what we've seen is that bus side start to accelerate. But then we've seen what I would call a whole lot of companies that are in choppy waters, and those that have sort of suffered and not had the sort of profit result. And you would think that something like City Chic, which is a fashion business, would be in trouble, but it's actually in a sweet spot because all the ISO kilos that everybody's put on has suddenly resulted in larger size clothing becoming really popular. So, but then you look at what's happened to other businesses and how hard it is for someone like Kathmandu, who are selling outerwear and no one's out and about traveling at the moment, becomes really hard. And Lavissa, where no one's out there buying jewellery and bags. And the Ascent Group, which has been in the press more recently, Athlete's Foot and Platypus and Hype Chains, etc., they're all finding it really difficult in this environment. And I think, I'm not saying that they're going to run into financial difficulty, but there will be an acceleration of companies that either move into administration or move into voluntary administration or move into liquidation. And there's no doubt that they can't manage the current situation because of what's happening not only on a global basis, but what's happening in a local basis. And if you think about it, there are now 170 countries around the world that are in recession. And the IMF has actually declared that there will be more move into that recession environment. And you've got this added thing of what I call the sort of cocooning back to protectionism, where people are trying to manage everything locally and the supply lines, as you've rightly pointed out, getting interrupted. And therefore, we're going to see the advent of things like various tariffs being reintroduced in various fields, protectionism policies to protect local industry and rebirth local industry. So that's also going to play on some companies that had an over-reliance on China or an over-reliance on single point of supply chain. So I think there's going to be a significant acceleration of what's happening. I mean, unemployment at the moment running at 1.5 million people at any one time, starting to accelerate. We've seen retail professionals searching for roles where demand far, where supply far outstrips demand. I think that's very obvious. A lot of retailers unwilling to commit to future purchases because of, as to use your phrase, the volatility, but also they're not sure what they'll have in the future. We've seen a $16 billion withdrawal in the quarter to June in superannuation funds, and something like 28% of the population put their mortgages on hold. And so what we've got is a false bottom. It's been driven by JobKeeper. It's been driven by people artificially propping up the economy. When that concludes, I think there will be a significant acceleration of people moving into administration, particularly those with a high reliance on bricks and mortar, those that have got heavy rents, those that have got single point sensitive supply chains, and those that unfortunately are in the wrong space of things like outerwear and fashion, etc., finding it really, really difficult. So I think there will be an increase in the number of companies closing down. Some will be done very gently. And I think a good example is if you look at all the coffee shops in Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane CBDs, and you think how many of those will actually reopen when things get back to normal. And my guess is probably a quarter of them won't reopen at all. And I think in retail parlance, we're going to see exactly the same thing happen. I think nobody will be announcing massive plans for bricks and mortar expansion. Nobody will be announcing massive plans for investment. You'll be controlling the amount of capital you spend. You'll be controlling your cost base, and you'll have that lack of confidence. And that in itself will perpetuate in what we would call a real difficult time for retail over the next 12 to 18 months. But there's not only implications, I think, for the financial aspect of business, there's also implications for retail teams and individuals. So you're seeing that, Anthony, that retail teams and individuals being affected?
Yeah, absolutely. I was only speaking to a store manager of a retail outlet last night, and they summed it up by saying they've seen the best of people and the worst of people, and particularly for people in retail stores, at that grassroots level. I think they've been exposed to this every day, and to be frank, I think quite courageous in some of the situations they've had to operate in. If I put a very much a pragmatic, practical hat on, and I think about the individuals in retail and what I'm seeing and hearing, it's a new way of having to work. Particularly if you work in food, then hygiene's always been prevalent, but there's another level of rigor and pressure to make sure that you are maintaining that hygiene, that the customer sees you as being hygienic. It's not just, yes, I washed my hands after I went to the restroom. How do you demonstrate that you're hygienic to a customer in the store? It's the training that goes along with that. It's the awareness. It's helping people understand that. It's moving to contactless working and things that people might do. And, it doesn't matter what retailer you are, embedding process is always difficult. Suddenly you've got to change those processes that have been fundamental in how you work because you're moving to contactless working. Hearing a lot of noise around rostering. It's about that flexibility. It's about how do you take, particularly in distribution centers, how do you split your teams into an A and a B team so that if A team goes down because there's an outbreak and a positive case detected, your B team can continue to operate, particularly in support offices across merchandising teams and replenishment functions, same sort of thing. How do you look at your teams differently? How do you manage the physical space to keep them safe, to mitigate risk, but then have the contingency planning both in terms of rostering, in how you structure your team. So if something does happen, God forbid, you've got a continuity because you've been able to think that through and plan ahead of that. I think remote working, particularly for people in support offices, has been one of the biggest changes. I was on leave the week before, I guess, COVID broke out, for want of a better word. I got a call on the Friday, you're not going back to the office. That was on March the 19th, and I have been into the office 5 times in that period. So that's been a big impact. The flip side of that is I think what it's shown people is that anything is possible. To think that you can move particularly support functions for a retail business into a remote working environment and all the complexity that has had to be managed. And to do that, we've leapfrogged where, I guess, remote working was heading. But as a retailer, that means you've got to provide the tools, the infrastructure, the ways of working to enable that to happen. I think the most critical thing, though, Bernie, is thinking at the personal level. It comes back to uncertainty. It comes back to that team member who might not be impacted, but they have a family member who's lost their job or had reduced hours. It's about people who are feeling vulnerable because of isolation. And I'm privileged to manage a fairly large team. And the thing that's most on my mind isn't so much the inventory, isn't all those things. It's how do you keep people with a healthy state of mind when they're working remotely from home, when you don't actually know what's going on in their personal lives, but you're trying to get them to meet demands and hit deadlines. So I think the onus is on retailers to think at that individual level at this time. Think about what are the support structures you can put in place for your team. How do you continue to build and maintain culture in that remote working environment? Because at the end of the day, you take people out of retail, And yes, I know there's the online argument, but even in an online environment, you still need people. So for me, if I think of the most critical thing retailers can do here, and we talk about people being our greatest asset, is really think about your people, how they're working. You made a great point before. This isn't going away anytime soon. We're in for the long haul on this. So what are those structures, processes and support networks you put in place for your team? And I think that'll go a long way. Just changing tact a bit away from I guess that and the people side. Both of us have mentioned brands a little bit in this conversation. What do you think's happened to brands in retail during this time?
It's really interesting because I think that in many brands we've seen what I would call a moment of truth occur. And, if you think about the Australian market and the constant sort of beat up of market power, etc., of Coles and Woolies, and people talking about them as, as ugly big business that is squashing small business. And we've been reading that for many, many years. The fascinating part is I think they've shown their true colours, just as businesses like IGA have shown their true colours, and they've lifted their brand profiles significantly. And if you think of the work that all three did in helping Aboriginal communities, for example, and if you think about the work that Woolies and Coles and IGA did with early morning opening for pensioners and for those over the age of 60, you think about the work they did in helping local community and delivering food to those in need. We saw a significant metamorphosis occur in the respect that people have for those food chains, and that's been pretty much the case in places like Ahold overseas and a lot of the groups overseas as well. So I think the first thing is it's given the chance for people to prove, or brands to prove themselves during this period in what's really been a moment of truth. And if you look at the McKinsey study on brands, it says that 71% of customers lose trust in the brand if they put profit over people. And I think it was a good result from Woolies announced recently, where their sales have gone up but their profits gone down because of the cost of supply and the support they've been able to provide to the community. And I think that's really been a reflection of what's been undertaken. And similarly, a lot of the local IGA stores, even in my area, have been helping a lot of the community areas, providing special support, delivering product for customers. So it doesn't matter which part of the food game, I think it's been good for the brand. But then we've seen a lot of brands that have suffered a fair bit because they haven't had social, environmental and governance factors in place. And I think if they failed in putting people first, if they failed in maintaining good governance during this period, and they haven't adopted the social obligations that they have and put the price of toilet rolls up double because of the demand for it, or if they've worked on not looking after their staff and just laying them off during this period without supporting them, or they've looked at not pivoting into making alternate products. And I think the best example is Louis Vuitton, that stopped making handbags and started making hand sanitizer. I think if they haven't been able to do that, then they're going to struggle with their brand recognition going forward. And so I do think it's been a little bit of a pinch point. I mean, retail margins have gone down. 2012, they averaged about 8%. 2018, they're about 4.3%. And who knows what they'll be in 2020, probably lower again. And so we've got this slippery slide of retail bottom line margins, combined with now the greater need for social support, social needs and governance, and more importantly, looking after people. And so I think add to that now, people are going to be more interested in what's happening in my local area and what's happening in sustainability in my local area as well. And so the world's changed from a brand point of view. And I think the price orientated, stack it high, sell lots of it, right the way through to the belief that it's not a people business, it's a commodity and price business, will change mindset. And I think we're going to see some real winners and losers coming out of this. I mean, if you look at the announcement, for example, that the LVMH have walked away from the deal to buy Tiffany, which is something like a 14 billion euro deal. You look at that and you think, well, why would they do that? And obviously they're worried about a brand like Tiffany coming out of the pandemic. What will it look like, and how different will it be? And will people want to rise to pay the price for premium jewellery? And there's a million examples in a similar form. So I think those that have performed well during this pandemic period and put people in front of profits will be incredibly successful going forward. People have long memories for brands that support them very, very well. And so that world has changed. And I think if you've pivoted, if you've made sure you've looked after your people, then that brand recognition is going to be very, very high. And I think as we go through tough economic times and the lack of premiumisation, and as we go through private label and people saving for a rainy day and using more things such as afterpays, etc., the economy is going to get tough, and they're going to spend their money on a brand that they respect and a brand that has treated them well during this period. But I guess that's going to be part of the new normal. So, Anthony, how would you describe the new normal across retail?
Yeah, look, I think it's a term that's been used a lot, right? The new normal. I think some things will get back to similar, and other things will continue to be very different. I think what we'll see is a normality around a new normal, a new baseline, if you will, around the categories people are shopping, the products people are shopping, and what that means for category teams and for supply chains. And I think as that plays out, that'll occur. I don't think the larger basket sizes will continue indefinitely, and I think there's some pragmatic reasons for that. People, it's not the same risk profile, so they're not having to continue to buy as much. Reality is people don't actually have the storage space for all that toilet paper, right? There comes a point when you got nowhere to move. But I think, and you keep alluding to it, the economic realities of it will force people to go back to more normal basket sizes, I think. What's in that basket could be very different in terms of the brands that they were purchasing before versus now, the trade-offs to private label. How do they make their dollar go further? I think that's the new economic reality that we're going to be thinking about. I think local will continue to play a stronger role going forward. People have, whether it's their local IGA, their local butcher, their local baker, whatever it is, people have rediscovered the local areas, I think, through this. There's that community feel that has come through some of this. As you just have to look on any community-based Facebook page about people trying to support each other in the local community, support the local coffee shop, support that. So I think local will be more prevalent than it's ever been before. I think loyalty will be less. I think people have had exposure to new retailers, new products, new ways of shopping, new channels, very much driven by the economic reality of the individual. But I think just purchasing a product because that's the one I've always purchased is going to become less and less. And I think that'll have implications, particularly for at a retail level around brands and at a manufacturing level around their brands. Price will come back in a big way. Not that it ever totally went away, but I think there was a short period of time where availability trumped price. So I think that new normal is going to see, particularly given those economic conditions you outlined, price is going to become even more prevalent. So value will have an even heightened place in this new normal. I think new normal is going to mean stronger collaboration. The collaboration we've seen, not so much retailer to retailer. I think that was a small pocket of need that the government saw and created the opportunity for. But in terms of the end-to-end supply chain, heightened levels of planning, collaborative forecasting, shared supply chain, to be honest, I think are things that will come out of this. Continue the trajectory, as you said, we've leapfrogged in the online space. I think people who may have resisted that before or did it on the odd occasion, it's now had to become their norm. So that will continue to grow and people will need to invest in that. And I think the final thing in the new norm is working from home. The organisation I'm part of, we've started to slowly, in the States where we can, move back into the office. But the reality of that is a lot of people have realised that there's productivity benefits, there's work-life balance benefits, There's economic benefits, particularly if you're having to live in Western Sydney and travel into, a place, or same in Melbourne, and you've got toll roads and things like that. But we haven't dropped the ball, right? That's the thing. That's always been the fear with remote working. Well, what are they doing at home? Are they being productive? And to your point around people, those organisations that have put their people first, empowered them, I actually think the new normal will be a lot higher levels of remote working, coming to the office for a function. And when I say function, I mean that in terms of a functional requirement. There's a particular collaborative workshop, there's a team building exercise, not because I need to do my job. So I think that has big ramifications moving forward, whether that's commercial real estate, office space. I think the new normal is very much going to be a remote normal. And I don't think, it's probably one of the things my team tell me, I don't want to go back to a 9 to 5, 5 days a week in the office. So I think that's something we need to take as a positive, I guess, a learning out of this, and make the most out of that moving forward. We've spoken a lot about a lot of different changes, Bernie, and about retail, about brands, about products, about people, about supply chains, but all of that kind of ends up in a shopping centre, in most occasions, in terms of the consumer going into a shopping centre to shop a particular retail store for the products they're after. What do you think this all means for shopping centres?
It's funny. I think linking your previous point, if you go to places like India or UAE or even Africa, the shopping centre is the local community environment that people go out shopping. It's air conditioned, which they love, and they'll meet people there, and that becomes an important part of social infrastructure. And I think to some extent that's been the case in Australia, but probably not as much. And the demise of strips and move into large monster shopping centres. And remember, Australia's shopping centres are predominantly based around the water in the cities, and therefore that's why they're heavily demanded and heavily overpopulated, because although we've got a big country, as you know, people stay near the water and stay near the main city, and therefore there is a heavy demand for space in those shopping centres. But I think the shopping centre owners are in for a protracted challenge. I think it's going to be very difficult for them. I think they're going to see their shareholder returns deteriorate significantly over the next few years. And I think they're going to see credit risk occur with retailers in malls that may go broke or not necessarily be able to fund their bills. And I think that sort of means that not a particularly good way forward for REITs and shopping centre owners. I mean, there isn't going to be retailers looking for more significant space in bricks and mortar when you can reach customers through the digital age. And I think that's going to continue to accelerate, and therefore, productivity or sales or profit per square metre is going to deteriorate as well as this digital sort of recalibration occurs. I mean, it is going to be different too for what you would call the A class, the B class and the C class malls. I think Bondi, Sydney City, Chatswood, Chadstone, they're going to continue to thrive particularly well because they've got high populous infrastructure around, access and egress is good, parking and trams and trains, etc., all good. So they'll continue to still be quite a demanded space. But the B and C class malls are going to suffer dramatically. And I wouldn't be surprised if you see them converted to a lot more what I would call social outing events and things like bowling alleys and putt-putt and entertainment and more wider, more spread out food halls going into them. And I think you'll also see as part of that changes that occur in shopping centres where you could even have office lease space converted to office lease for space inside shopping malls that people work there as well as shop there, as they've got all this space that used to be in train with discount department stores and department stores. And I think that we're going to see a recalibration of the returns that shopping centre owners get, because the pressure is going to be on rents. And I think if I think about the history of retail and you look at how it changed towards who got the power, whether it was the customer having the power to demand a price, and then the retailers with data becoming more powerful in understanding the customer, and the shopping centres will always sort of take it or leave it, particularly in the premium malls. That's going to change now, and they're going to have to vary their rent demands and their outgoing demands. They'll have no choice but to fill that space and make it practical. And we're seeing it now in commercial real estate, and we'll certainly see it in shopping centres going forward, that there'll be people looking for people to take space in shopping centres, reducing the size of shopping centres. And that, unfortunately, is going to be the part of, to use your phrase, the new norm going forward in space. So, total shareholder return for those malls are going to be very difficult. And as people want less bricks and mortar space, the knock-on effect, and it is a lag factor, it takes a while to impact the valuations on shopping centres, are going to find it particularly hard. And they're going to have to pivot, just as the customer has, and just as, if I use the Louis Vuitton example, they're going to have to pivot to other uses of that space and other uses of that mall. And lastly, I think the other thing that's not been thought about is that as the rents come down in your B and C class malls, and it becomes more attractive, one of the reasons that we saw stores roll out into rural and regional Australia has been because the rent is 30 to 40% cheaper. So you can get a property in Orange, or you can get a property in Ballarat or Bendigo or in Kingaroy that you can get significantly cheaper than what you can in the middle of the CBD. And that gap of 30 to 40% was there. I just wonder whether now, because the price of rents will come down in CBD Australia and in the main metropolitan areas, whether in fact it'll be as attractive for people to go into rural and regional areas. And we could see some of the rural and regional infrastructure affected even more as rents. You can get a very good rent for going into a place such as on the outskirts of Ipswich, or somewhere at Castle Hill or Parramatta, or down into past High Point in Melbourne. So as you can get a better price on rents in those, doesn't mean you're going to stop rolling out into rural and regional Australia, which is going to further affect both population and provision of services in those environments. So I think certainly a tough time, I think, for mall owners as well as retailers. And I think, as we've highlighted today, COVID-19 has had a significant impact just about through all parts of the retail environment, and certainly will continue to. Keith, let me hand back to you to talk a little bit about what you think, and probably more importantly, summing up the day and talking about the JB Award.
Thank you, Bernie. It's been really interesting reading a lot of the trade magazines over a period of time now. The level of shutdowns and things that you were just talking about in the UK is quite massive, with hundreds of people every week losing jobs and things like that. The other thing that crops up is looking at what happens to the key roles in retail that, with all of these changes, are coming about, and what should employees be doing to advance their careers. How do you get momentum and exposure at this time? Anthony?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. It was interesting when I think about this. I actually don't know so much if the key roles will change. Obviously, there'll be greater roles and more need for expertise in online, in supply chain, and potentially move away from bricks and mortar. But for me, it's more about the capability that's going to be required. And if you kind of go back, right, there was a time where it was enough in retail to have experience. Right? You started as collecting trolleys like myself. You moved into checkouts. If you were good, you maybe moved into a department. You did a graduate program or something. You moved through, and it was that content knowledge that got you through. And then we kind of went through a period where you needed that, but yes, you needed some more qualifications. So, we saw the different retail qualifications starting to emerge, or like things. But the key thing for me, if I think about what's going to advance people's careers now, it's actually about being able to manage uncertainty. If you're familiar with the VUCA world terminology that came out of the US military, where you're talking about volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. Real world experience is important. Training and qualifications are important. But for people in key roles moving forward to advance their careers and add the most value, it's actually about their ability to manage that uncertainty, to manage that VUCA world, and to be able to have transferable skill sets. And when you talk about how do you get momentum and exposure at this time, I think the key for people who are new to the industry, who want to develop their career, yes, focus on your content knowledge, on broadening your experience, but you need to demonstrate that you can deal with, and you're okay with change, that you're okay with ambiguity, that you can exist in that kind of VUCA world. So put your hands up for projects. You know, those things that are out of the box that are going to take you sideways, that might not be the linear way of thinking, but are going to expand your knowledge. And more importantly, for those people in decision-making roles that are looking for that next generation of leaders coming through, they want to see what happens when you take someone out of an area here and you put them in an area over there. Yeah, many years ago, and funnily enough, it was Bernie Brookes, took me out of being a produce manager and made me a bakery manager, and I'd never made a loaf of bread in my life. But the learning from that was, how do I take those skills and apply them in a different environment? And I think for me, if you think about career advancement and how do you build momentum and exposure, it's about putting your hand up, but doing it for things that aren't core to your competency and your knowledge, because leaders want to see people who can manage ambiguity. Now, the only certainty we have moving forward is there's not going to be any certainty about anything. So that would be my call out for people, particularly as they're moving through. Yes, focus on building experience. Yes, have your qualifications. Yes, have your knowledge, but demonstrate your ability to deal with uncertainty and move into areas you know nothing about, and have that transferable leadership.
Bernie, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think Anthony's comments are spot on in regard to multi-skilling and learning new things. And I think what can fall by the wayside in the current environment is education and I think skilling people up. And I think there's no doubt that you've got to go and self-educate. And if I think of the changes in retail and where you can get left behind, I got worried at one stage I was getting left behind in artificial intelligence. And so I studied artificial intelligence to find out how it works. And now I sit on the board of an artificial intelligence company. And so I think you've got to find what areas are going to be the new norm and how do I get into them and learn them and educate myself in them, because it may not be that the company's going to educate or see it as their role to educate. So find the area that you think it's going to be. If you're not equipped as a digital native and you need to learn more about social media and selling online, then go and do that. And similarly, so I think self-education and playing to your weaknesses is one important part, added to Anthony's multi-skilling. I think the other thing is, it's going to be very hard for people to get social skills with distant learning and distant management. And I think those social skills are something that it's going to be very hard to relearn and get back into it. I mean, funnily enough, there's so many people in retail that I know that met their partners actually in retail and learned a lot of their social skills on the checkout, or learned as pushing trolleys. And so I think to some extent, some of that can be a little bit neglected. So I think honing those skills is important. But also communications changed. I mean, if we all read sort of How to Win for Friends and Influence People back years ago, I mean, is there a version now for Zoom and for Microsoft Teams? Because you've got to learn a whole new era of communication. You've got to learn advocacy, and it's very hard to do that through a computer screen or a TV screen. So I think in many cases, adopting of the world's changed. And I think things such as the Joe Berry Award go a long way to fulfilling that. It educates you. It gives you some social skills. It gives you it tests you with the judges, and it helps your communication skills. And that's where I've been a strong advocate from that day. But I think the best thing that sort of describes what's going to be required from an individual point of view is not a comment that I'd make. It's one that Charles Darwin made. He said, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It's the one that is the most adaptable to change. And if you think about the change in communication, social skills, in education, in the knowledge base that you have to have, then you've got to learn to adapt. And I think Anthony summed that up very well when he talked about everything from supply chain to people to office environments. It's about adaptability going forward. And I think that's what something like the Joe Berry Award can work very well to help give you that great foundation.
Joe Berry Award 2021 opens on November 1st, but you can pre-register from the beginning of October through our website, joeberryaward.com.au. We were delighted to have you, Bernie and Anthony, with us today. The information that you put forward will be an enormous help to those who are about to get started writing an essay for the Joe Berry Award 2021. Thank you.